The monk who invented modern laughter. Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are not opening a tragedy, a Gothic nightmare, or a solemn meditation. We are opening a feast. A wild, riotous, and absolutely gigantic celebration of what it means to be alive. This is a book that will make you laugh until your sides ache, and then, in the quiet moments between the laughter, it will make you think. It is a book that was banned, burned, and condemned by the most powerful institutions of its time. And it is a book that has survived for 5 centuries, not in dusty libraries, but in the hearts of every reader who has ever thirsted for freedom. We are opening Gargantua and Pantagruel by François Rabelais. The man who wrote this book was a paradox. François Rabelais was a Franciscan monk, then a Benedictine monk, then a secular priest, then a physician, a scholar of Greek, a humanist, and, almost by accident, the author of one of the most scandalous and beloved masterpieces in all of literature. He lived in the first half of the 16th century, the age of the Renaissance, a time when the old medieval world of rigid dogma and fear was crumbling, and a new world of curiosity, exploration, and human potential was being born. Rabelais was at the very center of this earthquake. And his weapon, his instrument of revolution, was not a sword or a sermon. It was laughter. Deep, roaring, uncontrollable, healing laughter. He published his first book of giants under the ridiculous, anagrammatic pseudonym, Alcafribas Nasir. He knew he had to hide. The Sorbonne, the most powerful theological institution in France, was watching. They condemned his books as obscene, heretical, and dangerous. And they were right. They were dangerous. Because Rabelais understood something profound: tyranny, whether it comes from a king or a priest, cannot survive being laughed at. Dogma dissolves in the face of a good, honest, belly laugh. And so, he gave the world a story about 2 giants, a father and a son, who eat, drink, fight, study, and wander through a world that looks suspiciously like our own, only magnified to a monstrous, hilarious, and deeply revealing scale. So, pull up a chair. Pour yourself a glass of something good. Forget everything you think you know about classic literature. We are about to enter a world of boundless appetite, brilliant wordplay, and a wisdom so profound it could only be expressed through the most absurd and hilarious stories ever told. Let us begin the story of Gargantua. Let us begin, as all good things begin, with a birth. Part 1, Gargantua, the birth of a giant and the 2 educations. Our story begins not with a prince, but with a king named Grangousier and his wife, Gargamel. They were good, honest, and extraordinarily large people. And on one particular day, they threw a feast. It was not just any feast. It was a feast of epic, biblical, and frankly stomach-churning proportions. Thousands of fattened oxen, tens of thousands of sheep, mountains of sausages, rivers of wine. The guests ate and drank for days. And in the midst of this glorious, gluttonous chaos, Gargamel, who was 11 months pregnant, began to feel the pangs of labor. The midwives rushed to her side. They were drunk, of course, and clumsy. They gave her an astringent that was so powerful her whole body contracted, and the child, instead of taking the ordinary route, was pushed upwards. He climbed through her body, out her left ear, and into the world. And as soon as he emerged, this extraordinary infant did not cry. He roared, with a voice that shook the very foundations of the castle, a single, thunderous demand: drink! 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 The baby was named Gargantua, a name derived from a phrase his father uttered upon seeing the size of his son, que grand tu as. How big you have! The name stuck, and the child grew, as the old saying goes, not by the day, but by the hour. His appetite was limitless. He drank the milk of 17,000 cows. He ate entire herds of cattle for lunch. He was dressed in a coat made from 1,000 ells of blue velvet. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated, magnificent excess. His father, Grangousier, loved him without measure, but he was a man of his time, and he believed that a prince must be educated. And so began the first great experiment of the book, the education of a giant. Grangousier, a man of the old school, hired the finest scholastic tutor he could find, a doctor of theology named Thubal Holofernes. This man was a genius of the old method, the modus significandi, which is to say, he was a master of rote memorization, empty logic, and the ability to make a young boy hate learning with every fiber of his being. He taught Gargantua the alphabet backwards, and then forwards. He read him the Acts of the Apostles, the Book of Genesis, and endless grammatical treatises, all of which Gargantua could recite perfectly by heart, without understanding a single word. The boy would spend hours each day memorizing dusty texts, never moving, never questioning, never seeing the sunlight. And the result of this magnificent, state-of-the-art education? Gargantua, as Rabelais tells us with a perfectly straight face, became a fool, a simpleton, a dreamer, and a ninnyhammer. Seeing his son reduced to a state of bovine stupidity, Grangousier was desperate. He was visited by a young page who had been educated in the new, humanist way, and the contrast was so startling that he fired Thubal Holofernes on the spot. The old tutor, it is said, died shortly after of a broken heart, a victim of the collapse of his own obsolete logic. In his place, a new master was appointed. His name was Ponocrates. And his method was the complete, total, and radical opposite of everything that had come before. First, Ponocrates did not rush into teaching. He observed. He saw that Gargantua's mind was clogged with useless information and his body was sluggish from years of inactivity. So, he called in a doctor who administered a medicine that made Gargantua forget everything he had ever learned. His mind was wiped clean, a fresh slate. Then, the real education began. Ponocrates' method was a miracle of common sense. Gargantua would wake at 4 a.m. While the servants rubbed him down and dressed him, a page would read aloud from the Bible, in a clear voice, explaining the meaning of each passage. Then, they would go outside and observe the sky, comparing it to what they had studied the previous night about the stars. After that, a rigorous session of physical exercise, running, jumping, swimming, wrestling, lifting heavy stones, climbing ropes. The body and the mind were not separate. They were two halves of a single, magnificent human being. His body clean and his mind sharp, Gargantua would then study the classics, Homer, Virgil, Plato, Plutarch. Not by rote, but by discussion, by questioning, by connecting the ancient wisdom to the present day. He would eat a simple, modest lunch, during which they would discuss the nature of the food they were eating, its origin, its medicinal properties. There was no wasted moment. Every act, from the most intellectual to the most bodily, was an opportunity for learning. And Gargantua, under this new method, blossomed. He became not just a scholar, but a wise, strong, and virtuous man. But the world, as Rabelais knew, does not allow such idyllic experiments to go unchallenged. While Gargantua was learning to be a wise prince, a storm was gathering on the borders of his father's kingdom. A neighboring king, a petty, hot-tempered tyrant named Picrochole, was about to start a war over the most absurd, ridiculous, and trivial cause imaginable, a basket of bread. The peace was shattered. And Gargantua would be called upon to put his new education to the ultimate test. The world of ideas was about to collide with the world of violence and stupidity. Part 2, The War of the Bakers and the Founding of the Abbey of Theleme. The idyllic peace of Grangausier's kingdom was shattered not by a grand political intrigue, but by a quarrel so petty, so absurd, and so utterly stupid that it serves as Rabelais' definitive commentary on the nature of all war. It began in the town of Lerne, where the shepherds of Gargantua's land had come to a fair. The day was hot, and they were thirsty. They asked a group of bakers from Lerne, who were proudly parading their fine, fresh bread, if they would sell them some at the market price. The bakers, a famously arrogant lot, refused. Instead of a simple business transaction, they began to mock and insult the shepherds, calling them gluttonous bumpkins and barefoot peasants. The shepherds, humiliated, protested. And then, one of the bakers, a man named Marquet, with a grand sense of his own importance, took a whip and began to lash out at the shepherds. The shepherds, who were strong, simple men, took this as a declaration of war. They seized the bakers' baskets and began to pelt the men with their own merchandise. A chaotic, furious, and utterly ridiculous brawl erupted in the middle of the street, with stale bread and pastries flying through the air like missiles. The bakers, defeated and covered in flour and humiliation, fled back to their city and brought their complaint before their king, a choleric, ambitious, and militarily incompetent tyrant named Picrochole. Without any investigation, without any attempt at diplomacy, Picrochole flew into a blind rage. He assembled his entire army, a motley, undisciplined, and chaotic force, and marched on Grangauzier's lands, burning crops, sacking villages, and terrorizing the peasantry, all because of a lost load of bread. The absurdity was monstrous, and the monster was war. Grangousier, a wise and peace-loving king, was horrified. He tried everything to make peace, sending ambassadors with generous offers. But Picrochole, driven by a mad, sudden ambition to conquer the entire world, he had already divided up the map in his feverish imagination, refused all negotiations. And so, with a heavy heart, Grangousier was forced to call his son, Gargantua, away from his studies and back to the battlefield. The giant prince rode to war, accompanied by his new tutor, Ponocrates, and a host of loyal nobles. But the true hero of this conflict was not a prince or a knight. He was a man of God. A monk. A being of pure, righteous, and terrifying fury. His name was Friar John of the Funnels. Friar John was not like the other monks. He did not spend his days praying in a dark cloister. He was a man of action, whose faith was expressed not in mumbled Latin, but in the vigorous defense of his monastery's property. When Picrochole's army invaded his vineyard, intent on stealing the grapes, Friar John did not turn the other cheek. He seized the heavy, iron-bound staff of the great cross from the chapel and waded into the enemy ranks, laying about him with a fury that was both terrifying and, as Rabelais describes it, deeply, gleefully satisfying. He struck down men not with the malice of a murderer, but with the righteous indignation of a man defending his home. He killed, as he later calmly reported, all those he found there, to the number of 13,622, without counting women and little children. It was an act of holy hyperbole, a miracle of slaughter. Gargantua, meeting this extraordinary man, was instantly charmed by his energy, his honesty, and his complete lack of hypocrisy. After the Great War was won, thanks in no small part to Friar John's unorthodox methods and Gargantua's strategic brilliance, the giant prince wanted to reward his new friend. He offered him a position as abbot of a great, ancient monastery. But Friar John refused. He had no interest in ruling over a house of men whose only business was the mumbling of many legends and psalms, which they understand not at all. He wanted to live differently. And so, Gargantua gave him a gift, the resources to build a new kind of religious order, a place where life could be lived according to a single, glorious, and revolutionary rule. This new order was called the Abbey of Theleme. Its name means, will, in Greek. It was a monastery in name only. In reality, it was a utopia, a philosophical ideal built of stone. It was designed for young, noble, well-educated men and women who wanted to live a life of freedom, beauty, and honor. The abbey had no walls, signifying that the virtuous soul has nothing to hide and fears no outside influence. It had no clocks, because the only true measure of time is the rhythm of a good life. Its inhabitants could come and go as they pleased, marry, grow rich, and live in total liberty. They spent their days in pleasant conversation, reading, writing poetry, playing music, learning languages, and engaging in the noble sports of chivalry. The entire abbey was a hymn to the ideals of the Renaissance, the dignity of the human being, the power of education, and the possibility of a harmonious community of free individuals. And the only rule, the single guiding principle inscribed over the great gate of this magnificent establishment, was a phrase that has echoed through the centuries as the ultimate manifesto of Renaissance humanism. It was a rule that contained no prohibitions, no punishments, no dogma. It was simply this: fais ce que voudras. Do what thou wilt. For Rabelais, this was not a license for chaos. It was a profound statement of faith in human nature. He believed that free people, well-born and well-educated, have a natural instinct towards virtue. They will avoid vice not because they are forced to, but because honor compels them. The rule of Thelium was the complete, total, and radical rejection of the old world of fear and coercion. It was, and remains, a beautiful, hopeful, and deeply challenging dream. Part 3, Pantagruel and the Birth of Panurge. Time, as it always does, moved on. Gargantua, the great giant who had learned to be wise and had built a utopia, grew old. And in his old age, his wife, Baadebec, gave birth to a son. The boy was named Pantagruel, a name that echoed the vastness of his destiny. But his birth was marked by a terrible tragedy. The child was so enormous, so impossibly large, that his mother died bringing him into the world. Gargantua was torn between two overwhelming emotions, the immense joy of holding his newborn son and the crushing grief of losing his beloved wife. He did not know whether to laugh or to cry. "Shall I weep or shall I sing?" he cried out. And in that moment of profound, human contradiction, he did both. He wept for his wife and sang for his son, and his tears and his laughter mingled together, a fitting beginning for a life that would be defined by both deep wisdom and riotous comedy. Pantagruel grew, just as his father had, into a giant of immense size and even more immense intellect. He was sent to the finest universities in France, where he studied the full breadth of the new humanist curriculum: law, medicine, astronomy, ancient languages. He was a prodigy, a mind so brilliant that he would eventually debate the most learned scholars in the land and leave them speechless. But a mind, even a mind as magnificent as Pantagruel's, needs a companion. And fate, which loves a good story, had a companion waiting for him on the streets of Paris. He would not be a nobleman or a fellow scholar. He would be a vagabond, a rogue, a genius of trickery, and the most unforgettable character in the entire sprawling epic. His name was Panurge. Panurge was a man of many talents, most of them dubious. He spoke over a dozen languages, knew 63 ways to make money and 214 ways to spend it, was an expert in seduction, and had a complete and utter disregard for any law, custom, or moral code that stood between him and his next meal. He was a survivor, a creature of pure, unfiltered ID. He was hungry, thirsty, and always in trouble. Pantagruel, the wise and noble giant, was immediately captivated by this strange, brilliant, and utterly shameless creature. There was a profound friendship between them, a bond of opposites. The giant and the rogue. The scholar and the trickster. The man of principle and the man of pure, unadulterated instinct. Pantagruel saw in Panurge a spark of something wild and vital that was missing from the dusty halls of academia. And Panurge saw in Pantagruel the one thing he had never had in his life: a protector, a patron, and a true friend. It was Panurge, with his restless, scheming mind, who would soon set the entire course of the rest of the story. He fell in love, or rather, he decided he wanted to be in love. He had chosen a rich, beautiful, noble lady of Paris to be his wife. But his attempts at courtship were, in typical Panurge fashion, a series of spectacular, humiliating disasters. He tried eloquence, she was disgusted. He tried gifts, she threw them back at him. He tried, in a final, desperate, and utterly characteristic move, a bizarre act of revenge involving a dog in heat and a church full of noblewomen. The result was a public scandal of epic proportions and a near-fatal beating at the hands of the lady's servants. Panurge was humiliated, terrified of marriage, and yet still, deeply, desperately, longed for a wife. He was caught in a classic, paralyzing dilemma. If he married, he would certainly be cuckolded and beaten. If he did not marry, he would be consumed by desire and loneliness. This was a question that could not be solved by logic or theft. It required a quest. And so, the great Pantagruel, seeing his friend's torment, made a decision. He would not consult the scholars of the Sorbonne, whose logic was as empty as Thubal Holofernes. He would not consult the courts, whose justice was a farce. He would seek the answer from the source of all true wisdom. He would consult the oracle of the holy bottle, a mysterious, all-knowing entity that resided at the very edge of the known world. A fleet was assembled. The finest ships were prepared, loaded not just with weapons and provisions, but with books, scientific instruments, and a library for the journey. Pantagruel, Panurge, Friar John, and a whole host of colorful companions set sail on a vast, uncharted ocean. The adventure of a lifetime had begun. And their destination was the answer to a question that lies at the heart of every human relationship: will I be loved, or will I be betrayed? Part 4, The Great Question and the Quest for the Oracle. The fleet sailed out of the harbor, and the great adventure began. Pantagruel, the wise and gentle giant, stood at the bow of the flagship, his eyes fixed on the vast, blue, and utterly unknown ocean. Beside him, Panurge was a bundle of nervous energy, his mind a whirlwind of hope and terror. The question he had asked himself 1,000 times now had an entire fleet dedicated to finding its answer: if he were to marry, would he be cuckolded, beaten, and robbed? It was a question that, in its own absurd, exaggerated way, contained the entire human fear of vulnerability, of commitment, of being made a fool by love. And so, even before they reached the oracle, Panurge, in his impatience, began to seek answers from his companions. He first consulted Pantagruel himself, who, with his characteristic wisdom, gave him a series of contradictory and ambiguous replies, arguing that both sides of the question were equally valid. Frustrated, Panurge decided to consult the ancient arts. He cast lots, opened the works of Virgil at random, and interpreted his dreams. Each method gave him a sign that he twisted to fit his own desperate hope. The signs were always, according to Panurge, a clear and unambiguous promise of a happy, faithful, and submissive wife. But Pantagruel, reading the same signs, gently pointed out that they could just as easily mean the opposite. The ambiguity was maddening. The truth was a slippery fish, and Panurge could not catch it. They decided to consult the living. First, they visited the Sibyl of Panzaust, a terrifyingly ancient witch who lived in a crumbling hut deep in the woods. She spoke in riddles, her words a jumble of cryptic, frightening images. She told Panurge he would be gobbed and engulfed, that his wife would flay him, and that she would not be thyn. Panurge, terrified, immediately interpreted this as a prophecy of a perfect marriage. The others were not so sure. Next, they consulted a deaf and dumb man, a poet dying in agony, an astrologer, and a theologian. Each consultation was a masterpiece of satire. The deaf man gave a series of inscrutable hand gestures that Panurge took as a guarantee of domestic bliss. The dying poet, in his final, rasping breaths, recited a beautiful, meaningless poem. The theologian, a learned doctor of the Sorbonne, gave a long, convoluted, and utterly useless speech that settled nothing. The quest for an answer was becoming a tour of human folly. Finally, they sought out a man whose profession was the purest expression of Rabelais' philosophy, a fool. His name was Triboulet, and he was a court jester, a man of immense ugliness but renowned wisdom. Pantagruel argued that a fool, being free from the constraints of logic and reason, is often the vessel for divine truth. They found Triboulet, gave him bread and wine, and presented Panurge's question. The fool listened, laughed, and then, for his answer, struck Panurge hard on the head with a wooden staff. Panurge was delighted. This, he declared, was the most positive sign yet. The fool's blow, he reasoned, was a clear symbol of the gentle, playful love his wife would show him. Pantagruel shook his head. The only interpretation he could see was that Panurge would be a cuckold, and a well-beaten one at that. With all earthly avenues exhausted, there was only one path left. The oracle of the holy bottle, the Divina Bouteille, was the final, ultimate authority. The fleet, which had been preparing while these consultations were taking place, was now ready. It was a magnificent armada, commanded by Pantagruel, with Panurge, Friar John, and a whole host of scholars, soldiers, and adventurers. Their destination was the Temple of the Oracle, a place of legend that lay somewhere in the uncharted waters of the west, near the fabled land of Lanternois. The ships, 12 in number, were loaded with provisions, scientific instruments, and a complete library. This was not just a voyage, it was a floating city of inquiry, a movable feast of humanism, sailing into the vast, mysterious unknown to ask a question that was both profoundly personal and cosmically absurd. The great quest for the answer had begun. And the sea, as Rabelais knew, was full of wonders and monsters. Part 5, The Voyage to the Oracle and the Final Adventures. The fleet sailed westward, into the vast, uncharted ocean, and soon the known world fell away behind them. What lay ahead was a sea of wonders, a chain of strange and fantastical islands, each one a distorted mirror reflecting the follies and vices of the world they had left behind. The first island they encountered was the island of the Chicanis, a place inhabited entirely by lawyers, bailiffs, and process servers. These strange, pallid creatures did not earn their living by robbery or violence, but by being beaten. They would hire themselves out to wealthy nobles, insult them, and then be viciously thrashed in return for a fee. It was, Rabelais tells us with a perfectly straight face, their only means of supporting their families. Friar John, with his characteristic lack of subtlety, suggested that such a useful profession should be well rewarded, and he generously demonstrated his appreciation by beating one of the Chicanis himself. The satire was as clear as it was brutal. The legal system was a parasite that thrived on its own corruption. They sailed on, past the Isle of Ruach, where the inhabitants ate and drank nothing but wind, and the island of the Pope Figs, a land of impoverished, miserable people who had once, long ago, dared to make a rude gesture at a portrait of the Pope and had been cursed with eternal poverty as a result. This was a direct, dangerous, and hilarious jab at the temporal power of the papacy, the kind of satire that could, and did, get authors into serious trouble. Then, they came to the island of the Papamanes, the polar opposite. The people of this land were fanatical worshippers of the Pope, whom they believed to be a literal god on earth. They were horrified to learn that Pantagruel had actually met the Pope, and they begged him, on bended knee, to describe the Holy Father's every gesture. When Panurge, ever the trickster, told them that the Pope wore a simple, plain robe, they wept with despair. But when he corrected himself and said that the Pope wore a magnificent, jewel-encrusted tiara, they danced and sang with a joy that bordered on ecstasy. The power of a symbol, Rabelais shows us, can be far greater than the power of truth. The most terrifying and revealing experience of the voyage, however, was not on an island. It was at sea. A violent, apocalyptic storm descended upon the fleet without warning. The sky turned black, the waves rose like mountains, and the wind howled with a demonic fury. Pantagruel, the wise and noble giant, stood calm and steadfast at the helm, his immense strength the only thing keeping the ship from being torn apart. Friar John, true to his nature, rolled up his sleeves and worked the ropes, shouting curses at the storm and at the heavens, his physical energy a match for the fury of nature. And Panurge? The great schemer, the brilliant talker, the man of 1,000 tricks. Panurge collapsed. He fell to the deck, paralyzed by a terror so absolute, so profound, that it stripped away all his layers of cleverness and revealed the raw, quivering, cowardly creature beneath. He wailed, he wept, he made extravagant, impossible promises to every saint he had ever heard of. He begged for his life, promising to build chapels and donate fortunes, all the while vomiting with fear. The storm was the great test, and Panurge, for all his brilliance, had failed it utterly. After many more such adventures, each a satirical jewel, the fleet finally arrived at its destination. It was a strange, mystical, and silent place, the island of Lanternois. And on this island, they found the temple of the divine bottle. It was not a grand, imposing structure, but a low, subterranean sanctuary, a cave of wonders. The walls were covered in mosaics depicting the story of wine and its sacred power. A priestess, a noble and serene woman named Bakbuk, welcomed them. She led them deeper into the temple, past a great fountain of wine, into the very heart of the sanctuary. The air was thick with incense and mystery. And there, in the center of the sacred space, was not a terrifying idol, but a simple, perfectly shaped glass bottle, resting on a fountain of alabaster, filled with a liquid that seemed to glow with an inner light. This was the oracle. This was the holy bottle. Epilogue, Drink. A Hymn to Life. Panurge, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror, was brought before the oracle. He was instructed by the priestess to perform a series of ritual gestures, to sing a hymn, and to listen. He did so, his voice trembling. And then, the priestess Bakbuk approached the holy bottle. She leaned close, as if listening to a whisper only she could hear. The temple fell into a profound, expectant silence. And then, she spoke. She uttered a single word. The word of the oracle. It was not a long, complex philosophical treatise. It was not a prophecy of doom or a promise of eternal bliss. It was a simple, clear, and magnificent command. The word was, Trinch. Drink. The travelers were stunned. What did it mean? Bakbuk explained with a serene smile. The word Trinch is the most beautiful, the most divine, and the most universal word in all languages. It is not a call to mindless intoxication, but to a higher form of consumption. It means, drink deep from the well of life. Drink in knowledge, not from dusty books, but from the fountain of experience. Drink in the laughter of your friends. Drink in the beauty of the world. Quench your thirst for truth not through rigid dogma, but through the joyous, active, and endless pursuit of understanding. The answer to Panurge's question, the answer to all questions, was not a passive prophecy. It was an active invitation. His marriage, his life, his happiness would not be determined by fate. They would be determined by him. If he lived with courage, honesty, and a full heart, he would find joy. If he lived in fear and selfishness, he would find misery. Panurge was transformed. The fear that had paralyzed him for so long seemed to lift from his shoulders. He had received his answer, and it was the one he most needed to hear, even if he had not known it. The journey was over. The fleet sailed for home, carrying a crew of adventurers who had been to the edge of the world and back. And they carried with them a truth that Rabelais, the laughing monk, the daring doctor, the genius humanist, had hidden in plain sight within a book of giants, feasts, and absurd, scatological humor. The truth that the world is not a vale of tears to be endured, but a feast to be enjoyed. That laughter is not a sin, but a medicine. That the search for knowledge is not a burden, but the greatest and most thrilling adventure of all. I am Melesias. This has been the story of Gargantua and Pantagruel, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this feast of laughter and wisdom has nourished you, please subscribe. And the next time you raise a glass with friends, remember the great oracle. Remember the word. Trinch. Drink deep of life. Until next time.